The UN Security Council chamber is one of the most powerful boardrooms in the world. It's also one of the busiest. There have been more than 8,000 meetings since 1946. Why so many meetings? Its reason for existing is to maintain international peace and security, acting on behalf of all United Nations members. This month alone, it's held sessions on Colombia, Somalia, Libya, Mali, and North Korea. But not every seat at this table is equal. The Permanent Five, as they're known, Russia, China, France, the United States, and the United Kingdom each wield veto power on what resolutions can be issued. And when the foreign policies of these nations and their leaders don't align with the other members, they can use their veto card. Or they might decide to take matters into their own hands.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
If international peace and security is threatened, the UNSC is mandated to take prompt and effective action. The resolutions which do pass, from imposing sanctions to deploying peacekeepers, are binding on all UN members. But when one of the Permanent Five is directly involved in a conflict or has close ties to parties involved in a conflict, it can often mean taking prompt and effective action simply doesn't happen. As with many boardroom meetings, the political machinations often happen behind the scenes. So while the Council is responsible for protecting the public, it's not always up for public scrutiny, even when those discussions can directly affect the peace and security of hundreds of thousands of people in places like Myanmar, Yemen, and Syria. In October, the then UN humanitarian chief Stephen O'Brien gave his monthly briefing on Syria to the Council. Russia and China had both previously used their veto power on Syrian-related sanctions. O'Brien told the Council, "The buck stops with you."
The international community cannot fail the children of Aleppo, as it did in Srebrenica, Cambodia and Rwanda. If you don't take action, there will be no Syrian peoples or Syria to save. That will be this Council's legacy, our generation's shame.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Salman Sheikh in Paris. He's a former senior political advisor to the United Nations. In New York, we have Mona Khalil. She's a legal advisor at Independent Diplomat, a non-profit that assists developing countries. Also in New York is Alexandra Novosseloff. She's a senior visiting fellow at the International Peace Institute. Thank you all for joining us. Mona Khalil in New York, let me start with you. Does the UN Security Council need to be overhauled?
I think fundamentally what the Security Council needs is a reminder that what it enjoys under the Charter are responsibilities and not prerogatives, powers, or discretions. It has failed miserably across the years in living up to that responsibility, a responsibility entrusted by the rest of the international community for the Council to act promptly and effectively. Unfortunately, dating back to the 2003 Iraq War, the Council has in fact been broken. Member states who are entrusted, these are the permanent members, with that sacred duty to ensure the fulfillment of the obligations under the Charter have themselves become the chief violators of that trust.
Salman, is the fundamental paradox here that when these countries accept the responsibility, they're just paying lip service because ultimately, if that contradicts with their national interest, they are responsible to their voters and to their people. They're going to find ways and means, whether it's through the veto powers or otherwise, to do what they want to. Is that how it's always played out, Salman?
Yes, it has, and it's certainly playing out like that today. National interest, nationalism is what is driving, and these permanent members of the Security Council in particular. And yet, they have to understand, and I think some do, but still are stymied by their own domestic audiences and domestic interests. They have to understand they represent effectively mankind. It's particularly when you have grave situations related to international threats to international peace and security. And here, genocide in particular is an area, and we're seeing it right now taking place in Myanmar with the Rohingya Muslims. That is a responsibility which they have to live up to. Otherwise, I agree with your previous speaker, the United Nations Security Council is not fit for purpose. But rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it does represent a set of ideals. We have to do better to reform it and transform it.
Okay, so as we try to reform it and transform it, let me ask Alexandra, should we be adding more countries to the mix to make it more fair? So we have the 5 permanent members. This was in the past. They joined in the past when the context was very, very different. Should we be seeing the likes of the G4 countries, such as Japan and Brazil and India and so on, and maybe even further afield, be added to the mix so that there's a greater diversity of opinion and political experience when it comes to making these critical decisions?
Yes, I mean, ideally we should expand the Security Council, but if we have more people around the table, it will be even more difficult to make any decisions. It's already very difficult between the 15 members of the Council. With 20 or 21, it's going to be even more difficult. So this is why the current P5, who have the right of veto, are hesitating in expanding the Council. That's a reality.
Mona, nobody wants to give up their special powers, so there's not going to be the political will for reform, and these are ultimately 5 of the biggest countries in the world. So how do you actually go about doing this? You can say, yes, we want reform, but who's going to be willing to give up, maybe not their seat at the table, but to make more space for others?
Well, I do believe that increasing the number and the representative character of the Security Council would certainly improve its credibility. I'm not sure that it would improve its effectiveness. What is needed is actually an overhaul of attitude and not necessarily an overhaul of numbers or of characters around the table. What we need is a reminder that 2 world wars led to the conclusion, the hard and fast realpolitik conclusion, that we need to respect certain guiding principles in the conduct of international relations in order to, in fact, serve national interests. The architects of the Charter saw fit to sit around a table together to determine the common collective responsibility of the international community to stop genocide, to stop mass atrocities, to stop the escalation of conflicts that could draw in the entire community of nations into protracted war and protracted violations of human rights and humanitarian law. It was for that purpose that this organization was fundamentally founded. And when the permanent members themselves betray that responsibility that they themselves were the original architects of, and not only shield others from responsibility, like the Assads of Syria, or the Aung San Suu Kyis of Myanmar, or the Bashirs of Sudan, when they themselves commit aggression in Iraq or in Ukraine, then what is to be said of a system? No matter how many USGs or ASGs you move around, that is not going to solve the ineffectiveness of the UN. It has to be the fundamental commitment of the member states to the roles and responsibilities they have assumed under the Charter.
Right. Alexandra, if I had to point out a few specific instances, and I had to say, look at Yemen, the US and UK supplying arms to the Saudi-led coalition involved in that war there. So any Security Council resolution is likely to get nixed or altered by their influence. If I had to give you Syria, and we've seen the examples over the past 5 years, the Russians are protecting Assad, they're on the Security Council. North Korea, the Chinese, I guess, semi-protect the North Koreans. And you're looking at Chinese protection for Myanmar when it comes to anything that might be close to binding. If we call it ethnic cleansing or genocide, Myanmar is going to be protected by the Chinese when it comes to the Rohingya issue. If I list all of those things and I ask you, what is the point of any of this, Alexandra? Don't I have a point?
Well, of course, I mean, I agree with Mona. You know, you have international standards that should be respected. But the fact is that this the Security Council is also a reflection of the divisions of the world. It's a body that has the most powerful members of the international community. They are each sovereign states, and they're each protecting their interests. So that is the difficulty, you know, when they see that it's not in their interest to solve some of these situations, or it's not in their interest to go to the table of negotiation, then, you know, what do you do? I mean, I think that still the Security Council is putting pressure on these states, you know, by voting sanctions or by attempting to vote sanctions, by putting resolutions on the table, even if they are vetoed. There is a pressure there, and that is not, you know, no state is immune completely to this pressure. So it takes more time than we would want to, but there is pressure on these states, and the international community is watching them through the Security Council.
Salman, is there sufficient pressure on these states when it comes to these specific instances? Can we say that it's enough that this is tabled and debated, and even if there is a veto or if there's some sort of blockage along the way, hey, at least they're talking about it? Is that enough, Salman?
Well, let me just say that I agree with what's been just said before. It's clear that the permanent 5-member Security Council, in some ways, have turned on the ideals which they were supposed to support after the Second World War. And you've given a number of examples. I myself was sitting in those closed rooms through the Iraq War when the United States led an illegal war there. Now, there are ways, and some we have been talking about in terms of adding more members, also changing voting, the voting structure, so that it's not always dependent upon a veto, but we have some sort of a majority voting, though that will be difficult. How do we achieve that? To your question, we have to find coalitions of like-minded states. As we're seeing even with climate change, it's no good anymore that such decisions are left to just 5 permanent members. And we've seen with tiny Liechtenstein, for example, in the UN General Assembly, marshalling more than 120 states to set up the international investigative mechanism for Syria. Now, that still takes time, but nevertheless, not even a small state like Liechtenstein is now toothless. It must use these kinds of methods. Other member states, Scandinavian states, other European states, the primacy of human rights and the responsibility to protect, as well as those in the rest of the international community. This cannot be a north-south matter anymore. Whether it's the abuse of human rights, or whether it's climate change, or the other wide array of threats to international peace and security which we're seeing now, it requires coalitions of the diplomatically willing to come together within the UN structures and to push harder. And that is a responsibility for leaders in those states as much as it is for, hopefully, the members of the P5 that hopefully will respond to that.
Mona, Salman found some room for optimism when he gave the example of Liechtenstein being tiny, but using the platform as a nation state at the UN to try and do some good. Do you find any cause for optimism? And have you heard anything over the past few days from among the many speeches given by world leaders that makes you think, hey, you know what? All is not lost. We can look forward, and there might be some room for encouragement here.
We must always remain optimistic, and that human nature, as often ugly it can be, it can equally inspire and it can equally lift out of great chaos, great fear, and great misery, and that is what we count on. Indeed, Liechtenstein has set an excellent example, and as such a small state, but such an inspiring one, should certainly hopefully inspire others to do the same, to rise to the challenge, to assume the responsibility that the Charter entrusted on the member states, to invoke possibly the Uniting for Peace resolution so that the General Assembly can exercise its residual power to enforce the principles of the Charter and to uphold the responsibility to protect that it has so clearly and unequivocally endorsed in the past. So there are mechanisms in place. There are Charter principles that have been untapped. There is a new Secretary General that we all look to for hope and inspiration, for the kind of independent proactivity that we saw when he submitted a letter to the Security Council outlining solid and concrete recommendations on how to stop the killing and restore humanitarian access in Myanmar. We would like to see more of that from the Secretary General and from the Secretariat at large. That independence, that recognition that it is the sixth organ of the United Nations and not merely an echo or a servant of the member states. It should have its own voice, it should have its independent position, and we look to Secretary General Guterres to do more of the same.
And Salman, as a man who was at the table for many years and who's seen Secretary Generals come and go, do you trust Antonio Guterres to lead the reform agenda, Salman?
I do. When he was running for Secretary General, I thought he could be the new Dag Hammarskjöld, probably the most successful, at least in terms of pushing the UN Charter, Secretary General there has been, who tragically died in a previous era. This Secretary General knows full well, by putting the resolution of conflict and the maintenance of peace and security at the top of his agenda, that this is probably the last chance for the United Nations as a whole, and particularly its organs like the Security Council. If we're not able to summon, as humanity and as member states and as those who are organized in a way to impact on member states, if we're not able to summon ways in which to overcome the threats that face us, we will see that this United Nations will collapse, rather like we saw the previous League of Nations, and it will take us into a more bloody, even bloodier set of chapters in human history. Now, the lucky thing is we set up the United Nations built on a set of ideals, and it is those ideals which do mirror, I think, what the human society and the global community wants, by and large. President Trump, when he speaks in a different way, is seen as an outlier. When he joins the effort to reform and to support and to make more effective the United Nations, then he joins the consensus. And I think that is what now leaders, world leaders, have to do, and the rest of us have to push them towards.
Alexandra, what do you think of the point that Salman made regarding the League of Nations? I mean, there was a League of Nations. It took a world war for everybody to realize that this thing's not working and we need to rework it, revamp it, and create a new organization. Is there a fear that it's going to take something catastrophically bad for everyone to realize that the UN needs to be reformed? Does it have to be another world war before the UN gets fixed, Alexandra?
Well, no, I think we shouldn't go that far. I think the UN is maybe the only organization that have kept reforming itself for decades. So because it's a world organization of 193 member states, because there's this situation of the powerful states that have a right to veto, it takes decades to improve the work of the organization to reach those ideals that were set up in the Charter. But I must say that, the drafters of the Charter were conscious of the fact that when the interests of the P5 are at stake, the Council will likely not be able to make decisions or good decisions. So I think we should keep being optimistic. The UN is reforming itself constantly. The Secretary General has just put on the table a number of quite deep reform agenda, in particular on the management of the organization. And I think it's up to each and every member state also to realize that it should give more room of maneuver to the Secretary General to make the organization more effective and more able to deliver on the ground and to protect the population.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I wanted to ask about this, but we are running out of time, so I won't. But there is an almost separate conversation regarding just how big the bureaucracy is and how bloated it is, and if it's actually capable to be agile in any way because it is so big. I wanted to go down that route, but I have to move on. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you, Salman Sheikh, Mona Khalil, and Alexandra Novosseloff. I thank you all for joining us on this episode of The Newsmakers.